Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a world that most people today will never truly know, and if you were really there, you probably wouldn't survive this schedule of sleepless nights and endless copying by candlelight. Picture it. The year is somewhere in the 12th century, though time inside stone walls always feels a little elastic. Outside the world is dark, damp and restless, but here inside a monastery you find yourself wrapped in silence, so complete it feels almost alive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The cloister around you breathes with quiet stone arches. You trudge slowly under their curved ribs, feeling the damp coolness radiate from centuries-old masonry. Each echo of your footsteps seems to vibrate far longer than it should, like the building itself is humming back at you. You notice how the courtyard, just glimpsed through an arcade, is black and still except for a few stubborn weeds pushing up between flagstones. Monks call this their garden of silence, though it's mostly just herbs that look like they've given up on life. The air tastes faintly of smoke and candle wax, but also of ink, the iron gall variety that clings metallic and sour to your nose. That's because somewhere deeper in the complex, men are bent over desks copying words that they believe can save souls, or at least stop the spread of ignorance. Historians still argue whether these scriptoria were places of pure devotion or practical necessity, were monks dutifully preserving divine truth, or just the medieval equivalent of human photocopiers. The answer is probably both, depending on whether you ask a pious abbot or the poor monk whose quill hand cramps every 5 minutes. Here in the cloister, though, before you even step into the writing room, you sense that strange blend of sacred mission and sheer exhaustion. The silence is thick, but not empty. You hear faint creaks of wood, the occasional cough from a distant dormitory, maybe even the muffled groan of a monk trying to stretch his aching shoulders in the dark. A mainstream fact drops in here. Monasteries weren't just about prayer, they were centers of knowledge production across medieval Europe, where most surviving manuscripts of classical antiquity were painstakingly copied by hand. Without these midnight scribblers, you wouldn't be reading Aristotle or even laughing at ancient Roman jokes today. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some monasteries had rules so strict that a monk could be punished for sneezing too loudly during night prayer. Imagine being fined for allergies. That's one way to keep the silence sacred, and also a fast track to passive-aggressive, note-passing medieval style. As you walk deeper into the cloister, you notice how every detail of architecture seems designed to swallow noise. The ceilings are high, not because anyone needed the headroom, but because stone vaults carry sound upward away from sensitive ears. Every doorway is heavy wood, swollen with moisture, making it close in a muffled thud instead of a bang. Even the sandals of the monks are cut from soft leather, so that the shuffle of their procession sounds more like wind than footsteps. You reach out and trail your fingers along the cold wall. It's rough in some places, smoothed in others by centuries of hands doing the same thing. You think about the sheer monotony of their lives, prayer work, prayer work. If you had Netflix, they would probably classify your binge watching as a sin of distraction. And if you had TikTok, well, you'd be the devil's intern. The silence of the cloister feels peculiar because it isn't natural. Humans are noisy by default. You've never walked through a dormitory without hearing laughter arguments, or at least someone dropping a shoe. Yet here, discipline is so sharp that stillness becomes almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves enforce it. The monks believed silence was a tool for shaping the soul. You might just call it really effective noise cancelling. And yet within this hush, your ears adjust. Suddenly you hear things you'd normally miss: the distant drip of water in a cistern, the faint rustle of parchment turned somewhere behind a door, the almost imperceptible scratch of quill on vellum like a mouse gnawing at wood. You trudge further, your steps slower now, as if afraid of breaking the spell. One monk passes you in the corridor. His eyes are lowered, his pace measured, his lips moving silently in what might be a prayer, or just mental arithmetic? How many pages left before dawn? He doesn't look at you, doesn't acknowledge you, and yet somehow his presence reinforces yours. You're both participants in this silent theatre. The truth is, even monks struggled with the silence. Some wrote complaints in the margins of manuscripts, notes like, "The parchment is bad," or "The weather is cold," or, most honestly, "Oh, my hand." Historians still argue whether those comments were meant as private venting or secret acts of rebellion. Maybe both. But for now, before you see any of that, you stand in the cloister, inhaling the weight of centuries. Somewhere above the moon casts pale light through a narrow slit of a window, but inside only candles matter. The night is just beginning. Soon the bell will ring, summoning everyone to the next ritual. And you, unwilling guest or sleepy scribe, will follow them into the dark. Because here, in the peculiar silence of Monastic Scriptoria at midnight, you are not just a bystander. You are part of the hush. The bell comes first, as a shiver in the night. A deep, iron-throated sound that seems to rattle the stone bones of the monastery. You feel it in your ribs before you hear it clearly. The monks call it matins or sometimes vigils, and if you were one of them, this would be the moment you'd roll out of a thin straw mattress, rub your eyes and mutter something very unholy under your breath. You watch as figures emerge from doorways along the cloister. Bare feet slap gently on cold flagstones, robes brushing like whispers. Nobody talks, not even a hurried good morning, because the concept of morning doesn't really apply here. It's still pitch black outside. The only light comes from smoky lanterns hung in iron hooks, each flame guarded by a glass shield that makes the shadows bend and dance on the walls. The tolling bell repeats with slow insistence, a reminder that you can't just roll over and hit snooze. Back then, the bell was the medieval alarm clock, except there was no off button. And unlike your phone alarm, you couldn't throw it across the room unless you were willing to hurl several tons of bronze from a tower. Spoiler, monks didn't. You trail behind the line of cowled figures. They're wrapped tight in habits, the wool coarse and itchy, if you've ever touched it in museums. Their heads are bowed, their movements synchronized as if they've rehearsed this procession for years, which of course they have. Many entered the monastery as teenagers, some even as children, and by now the rhythm of midnight bells is as normal to them as brushing your teeth is to you. A mainstream historical fact here, monasteries divided the day and night into canonical hours, regular intervals of prayer that structured their entire lives. Midnight vigils were one of the most demanding, breaking sleep into chunks and leaving monks perpetually tired. Sleep science today calls this segmented sleep, and some argue it wasn't entirely unhealthy. Historians still debate whether medieval people naturally preferred this pattern or simply endured it because bells told them to. As the sound of the bell fades, you notice how silence floods back into its absence. It's almost comical, like a really strict teacher leaving the room, then snapping back in with a glare when you whisper too loudly. The hush has authority. You start holding your breath at random moments, realizing how even your exhale feels like it doesn't belong. But the quirky tidbit slips in here. Not all bells were serious. Some monasteries had a separate bell for the kitchen rung to announce mealtimes. Imagine being half asleep at 2 a.m., hearing the wrong bell and stumbling into the refectory only to find no food. A medieval prank, or maybe just bad acoustics. The monks gather in the chapel first. You peek through the door as they bow, kneel, chant. The sound is soft, more hum than song, rising and falling like waves. No instruments, no grand choir, just human voices weaving together in plain chant. If you've ever heard Gregorian chant recordings, you know the vibe: hypnotic, repetitive, somehow both empty and full. But your path tonight isn't to stay in the chapel. You're being pulled deeper toward the scriptorium, where the real midnight work waits. Still you linger at the doorway for a heartbeat, listening. The monotone singing has a drowsy rhythm, like a lullaby, meant not to soothe, but to discipline. You can almost feel your own breathing start to align with the chant's cadence. One monk coughs, suddenly breaking the spell. Heads shift ever so slightly in irritation. The man bows lower, as if apologizing with his whole body. You can't help but smirk. Some things never change. Sneeze in a quiet room, and you're instantly public enemy number one. They finish their vigil prayers and file out. You follow, blending into the shadows, your footsteps hidden by the shuffle of robes. The procession is calm, patient, but you sense the fatigue dragging at their movements. They're not saints in glowing halos, they're tired men with stiff joints and ink-stained fingers. You feel the shared weight of repetition pressing on them year after year. As you walk, you think about what silence meant here. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a kind of spiritual weapon. The idea was simple: if your tongue stayed still, your mind could better listen for God's whisper. Modern psychology might call it sensory deprivation, but here it's holiness. The irony, of course, is that most monks' thoughts probably drifted to very unspiritual things: warm beds, hot meals, or maybe the one time Brother Matthew tripped carrying soup and everyone laughed. The bell's echo still lingers in your ears like a vibration that doesn't know when to quit. You picture the bell tower looming overhead, its rope dangling frayed from centuries of pulls. Someone has the job of climbing up there, hauling the rope at precise times, no matter the weather. Imagine being the monastery's human alarm clock, eternally unpopular, but eternally necessary. The monks turn down a narrower hall now. You catch a draught of colder air and the faintest smell of ink. Your heart stirs with curiosity because you know you're nearing the scriptorium. But for now, you're still moving in, step with them, still captive to the rhythm of bells and silence. And as you trail through the shadows, you realize this is how they measured life. Not by seasons or years, but by the sound of a bell pulling them from one task to another. You standing here centuries later are still caught by its pull. The corridor stretches out like a tunnel, its walls sweating with centuries of damp. You trudge along it behind the line of monks, their habits swaying like pendulums in the half-light. The further you go, the more the air grows heavy with something new, not incense, not candle wax, but the faint tang of parchment vellum and the iron gall ink that already stains your imagination. This is the walk to the scriptorium, and though it's just a hallway of stone, it feels like crossing into another dimension, one measured not by hours but by letters scratched into animal skin. Your bare feet slap softly against the flagstones. The sound bounces up, rattles along the ribs of the vaulted ceiling, and then dies before it reaches the monks ahead of you. Their silence is so disciplined that you almost believe they've learned to mute their very bodies. One cough here, one creak of knees there, but otherwise nothing. Just the shuffle of sandals and the low murmur of wool against wool. Mainstream historical fact monasteries were designed around this kind of movement. Corridors often linked dormitories directly to the chapel and the scriptorium so that monks could flow between prayer work and study without stepping outdoors. Medieval winters in stone buildings were brutal enough inside. Nobody was volunteering to trek through snow at 2 a.m. just to copy a psalm. You glance up at a small narrow window, little more than a slit in the wall. Beyond it, the night sky glows with stars, sharper than you'd ever see from a city street today. For a moment you wonder whether the monks even noticed the stars anymore. Or did they keep their eyes low, bound to parchment rather than constellations? Historians still argue whether monastic life dulled men to the beauty of the natural world, or sharpened them into obsessive observers of tiny details. After all, the same monk who ignored a blazing sky might draw a beetle on the margin of his manuscript with astonishing accuracy. A quirky tidbit slides in here. Some monasteries actually carved noise traps into their corridors, small alcoves or dead-end corners where sound would swirl and vanish rather than carry. It's like the medieval version of acoustic panels, except instead of foam pyramids, you got lumps of rough stone and centuries of echo experiments. As you walk, you feel the pull of the scriptorium growing stronger. The monks ahead turn left, then right, navigating a maze of passages you would never memorize on your own. They don't need torches. Their bodies know the rhythm of this walk, even half asleep. Their pace is steady but not hurried. This is not a commute to the office. This is a ritual in itself. Every step reinforces the discipline of silence. You can't help but think how modern you feel compared to them. If this were you and your co-workers, someone would already be cracking a joke about the boss, someone else would be yawning dramatically, and a third would be carrying coffee. Here, though, the only thing steaming is the breath fogging from tired lips. And no, there is no medieval equivalent of Starbucks. Closest you'd get is a weak ale at supper. At a bend in the hallway, you pass a painted crucifix on the wall. The figure of Christ stares down, eyes half closed, mouth twisted. The candlelight makes his wounds glisten as though fresh. You wonder whether the monks trudging past this every night even still noticed it, or if their eyes glazed over long ago. For you, though, it feels like a checkpoint, as if the image itself is verifying, yes, you are headed in the right direction, yes, you're still inside the rules of silence. The floor dips slightly, slanting downhill, and the corridor grows even colder. Now the smell of ink is undeniable. You think about the ink itself, oak galls crushed with iron salts, mixed into a liquid that bites into parchment. Permanent, unforgiving. Once spilled, it scarred the page forever. No delete key, no backspace. If you've ever written an angry text and wished you could unsend it, imagine being a monk who just ruined 3 days of work with one clumsy blot. And you laugh quietly at the thought, though you stop yourself quickly because even your imagination feels too loud here. Maybe that's the trick of the place. The silence is so thick, it makes you paranoid about your own brain making noise. Another historical debate sneaks in. Were monks actually as silent as the rules demanded, or did they sneak whispers, jokes, and side comments when abbots weren't watching? Historians still argue, pointing to manuscripts with tiny caricatures of abbots, often unflattering, that suggest the quills sometimes doubled as outlets for mischief. Ahead, the corridor narrows even more, and finally, you see it, a door. Heavy, iron-bound, its edges worn smooth by countless hands pushing it open. The monks gather here for a heartbeat, almost like actors waiting off stage. One pushes the latch, the hinges groan softly, and for the first time tonight the silence doesn't win. It breaks. The sound rolls through the corridor like thunder, though in reality it's just a door squeaking. But when you've been walking in near total hush for half an hour, even a creak feels monumental. Inside, you glimpse flickers of orange light, dancing shadows, and the promise of rows upon rows of waiting desks. You pause on the threshold, feeling the weight of centuries pressing you forward. The long walk is over. The true midnight labor is about to begin, and you step across, leaving behind the corridor's chill, entering the strange warmth of the scriptorium. The door thuds shut behind you, and suddenly you're inside a chamber that feels both vast and claustrophobic. Vast because the ceiling rises high enough that shadows vanish into darkness. Claustrophobic because the walls are lined with desks, benches, shelves, and the hunched backs of men already at work. The scriptorium is alive, but alive in a way that whispers instead of shouts. The only soundtrack is the faint scratch of quill on parchment, like tiny insects gnawing. You stand still for a moment, just taking it in. Candles gutter in iron holders their flames, sending trembling halos across the walls. A few oil lamps burn more steadily, giving pools of golden light to certain desks. The air is thick, layered with the smell of ink, old vellum wax, and the faint must of damp wool robes. It's not unpleasant, but it's the kind of smell that clings. If you stayed here long enough, you'd carry it with you forever, a walking library musk. Mainstream historical fact, Scriptoria, were the production centers of medieval Europe's books long before the printing press. Every Bible, every Psalter, every commentary on Aristotle, all of it was copied line by painstaking line in rooms just like this one. Without these silent workers, entire civilization's knowledge might have disappeared. But let's not romanticize it too much. A quirky tidbit reveals itself quickly. Not every monk was thrilled about the job. Marginal notes survive where scribes complain bitterly about the cold, the bad parchment, the endless tedium. One famously wrote, "Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides." You can practically hear the medieval sigh, as he set down his quill. Historians still argue whether every monastery had a dedicated scriptorium or whether sometimes monks just copied books in whatever corner of the cloister was warmest. Some records suggest grand centralized rooms. Others hint at scattered desks tucked wherever light was decent. Standing here, you're inclined to believe the bigger vision, though maybe that's because this one feels like it was built to impress as much as to produce. You move closer to the nearest desk. A monk sits bent over the candlelight, striking the crown of his tonsured head. His quill dances, dipping every so often into a pot of ink. His lips move silently, copying each word, syllable by syllable. That's another trick. Reading aloud, even if only in a whisper, kept the rhythm steady and helped catch mistakes. It also means the scriptorium was never completely silent. It was more like a hive filled with soft buzzing of murmured Latin. Imagine a library where everyone's whispering to themselves instead of to each other. The desk is simple, a plank of wood tilted at an angle. A knife rests nearby, used not as a weapon, but as a tool to scrape off errors. Yes, parchment could be edited in a way: scrape off the top layer, smooth it again, and write over it. The medieval backspace key. Though if you did it too often, the page wore thin and tore. No undo button there. You watch as another monk gently sands the surface of a new sheet. He sprinkles fine dust over the page, then wipes it smooth, preparing it to hold ink. The dust is often pumice or chalk, designed to roughen the slick skin enough to catch the quill strokes. The motions are repetitive, practiced, hypnotic. The room hums with concentration. You notice how each sound becomes its own character. The squeak of a quill too dry, the faint sigh when ink pools too heavily, the shuffle of robes as someone adjusts. None of it is loud, but together it creates a texture, a woven fabric of quiet noise. It's the opposite of your modern office, where one person tapping too hard on a keyboard makes everyone want to scream. Here, every sound is part of the pattern, expected and absorbed. You feel your own breathing fall into rhythm with the room. Inhale on the dip of the quill. Exhale on the stroke across vellum. The monks, without intending it, have drawn you into their trance. But you also notice the weight pressing on them. Shoulders slump, backs hunch, eyes squint. Hours of this work carve lines into faces long before their time. Monastic life promised spiritual discipline, yes, but it also promised arthritis, eye strain, and a permanent ink stain on your thumb that never really went away. You chuckle at the thought, because really, isn't this just the medieval equivalent of working the night shift in a cubicle farm? Endless paperwork, zero recognition, all under a boss who insists it's for your own good. You half expect one monk to glance up, roll his eyes and mutter, "Living the dream, brother." The abbot does appear at one point, a tall figure gliding between desks. He says nothing, simply checks a page here, adjusts a lamp, there offers a nod. His presence is enough. You straighten your spine without even realizing it, as though you too need to impress him. The monks react similarly, shifting slightly, quills, steadier postures, firmer. Silent management at its most efficient. In a far corner, one monk rubs his forehead. The candle beside him sputters, dripping wax onto the desk. He sighs, then picks up the candle and moves it, shielding the parchment with his sleeve. The gesture is so human, so tired, that you feel a pang of recognition. Midnight is creeping on, and even holy men struggle to keep their eyes open. And yet the work continues. Letter by letter, line by line, the manuscripts grow. The silence of the cloister has condensed here, transformed into a steady rhythm of labor. It is peculiar, yes, but also strangely soothing. If you close your eyes for just a moment, you can almost believe you've become part of the scriptorium's breath itself. You drift further into the scriptorium, drawn not just by the whisper of quills, but by the objects themselves. The tools of the trade lie scattered across each desk, humble, yet oddly beautiful in their simplicity. A quill trimmed sharp from a goose feather, its shaft polished by use. A small knife for scraping errors gleaming faintly in candlelight. Little pouches of pigment, some chalky, some jewel-bright, waiting to bring pages alive. And beside each, a small pot of ink, black-brown, sometimes tinged faintly blue depending on the mix. You crouch near one desk studying the careful choreography. Dip the quill shake off the excess, draw the stroke. Too much ink and the letter bleeds into the vellum. Too little and it scratches dry. The monk's hand moves with slow precision, each line measured, almost mathematical. There's no rushing this work. Even a single word might take minutes. You realize suddenly that the entire book in front of him, a psalter perhaps, will take months, maybe years to finish. Mainstream historical fact vellum, the writing surface, wasn't paper, but animal skin, usually calf. Preparing it was a labor of its own, soaking, stretching, scraping, smoothing. A single Bible could consume the hides of hundreds of calves. This is why books were so precious, chained to library desks, insured like treasures. You're not just reading ink, you're reading a whole herd. You lean closer and catch a faint whiff of the vellum-oily animal still carrying the ghost of what it once was. It's a smell that never really fades. Imagine trying to focus on divine scripture while your page faintly reminds you of beef jerky. That's devotion. A quirky tidbit makes you grin. Monks sometimes used cat paw prints as accidental decorations. Cats roamed monasteries, freely keeping down mice who would otherwise chew through precious vellum. But cats also had a knack for stepping in ink and walking across half-finished pages. Instead of discarding them, scribes occasionally just left the prints in as if God himself had signed the manuscript with a paw. You move toward another bench where pigments are being mixed. A monk grinds a deep blue stone lapis lazuli imported from as far as Afghanistan. The powder glitters like starlight as he mixes it with egg white, creating the luminous paint used for sacred initials. This was extravagance, pure and simple. Only the most important books got such treatment, and only the wealthiest patrons could afford it. The gold leaf sits nearby, thin sheets that shimmer dangerously close to vanishing if breathed on too hard. Watching him work, you understand why manuscripts gleamed not just with color, but with literal treasure. Historians still argue whether this artistry was primarily spiritual devotion or a form of competitive display. Was a brilliantly illuminated page meant to glorify God or to show off a monastery's wealth to rival institutions? You suspect both motives mingled freely because human nature rarely paints with just one brush. You trail your fingers across the edge of a desk. The wood is scarred, worn down by centuries of elbows and tools. A groove runs along one side, a place where countless quills rested. These desks weren't just furniture, they were companions, silent witnesses to years of whispered words. The thought makes you pause. How many anonymous hands poured their lives into these pages? Names forgotten, only letters surviving. A monk at the far table sharpens his quill with a practiced flick of his knife. The sound is crisp, a sudden punctuation in the hush. Everyone else ignores it, used to the rhythm, but to your ears it's startling, like chalk squeaking across a blackboard. You wince, then smile. Every office has its annoyances. You notice too the small sandboxes on each desk, literally boxes of fine sand sprinkled across wet ink to help it dry faster. Without it, pages could smudge at the slightest touch. You picture a weary monk reaching for the wrong container one night, dumping grit into his stew bowl instead. Sleep deprivation makes fools of us all. But there's also grace in this routine. The tools themselves impose slowness. A quill forces you to pause, dip, and reset. Ink requires patience to dry. Parchment resists hurry, demanding careful strokes. In a strange way, the silence of the room is built right into the materials. Unlike your laptop, which encourages frantic typing and backspacing, these tools force a kind of meditative pace. You glance again at the pigments, red from cinnabar green, from verdigris, black from soot. Each carries its own history, its own risks. Verdigris, for instance, could corrode the parchment over time, eating holes in the very words it was meant to preserve. Imagine spending months illuminating a page only to realize your artwork was self-destructing. Medieval chemistry had a dark sense of humor. One monk pauses, flexes his hand, then shakes it out. His fingers are stiff, cramped from the grip. You feel an ache in your own knuckles just watching him. He dips his quill again, sighs, and continues. The persistence is humbling. The tools may be simple, but the labor behind them is relentless. And so you stand surrounded by knives, quills, pigments, and sand, each one a tiny character in this silent play. They are not flashy, not mechanical, but they are the reason these men's midnight work will outlast them by centuries. You lean on the edge of a desk, and for a fleeting moment you feel as if the tools themselves are teaching you how to slow down. You linger now on the human side of this strange chamber. The tools may be fascinating, but it's the bodies bent over them that hold your attention. Each monk is folded like a question mark, shoulders, rounded head, thrust forward, eyes narrowed against the dim glow of a candle or oil lamp. You can almost feel the ache radiating down their spines. The posture of patience is no small feat. It is discipline carved into the flesh as much as into the spirit. You watch one man shift slightly on his bench, rolling his shoulders before returning to the page. The movement is tiny, almost guilty, as though he fears the abbot might reprimand him for daring to stretch. His hand trembles slightly as he steadies the quill, but then the strokes even out again. Mainstream historical fact. Scribes spent so many hours hunched like this that chronic pain was common. We know from surviving notes in manuscripts that many complained of cold hands, tired eyes, and twisted backs. Some even wrote pleas to future readers. Whoever reads this book, pray for the poor scribe who copied it. Imagine finishing a long report at work and scrawling on the last page, "Please send ibuprofen." Quirky tidbit. Some monks actually doodled stick figures of themselves in the margins, slumped dramatically, holding quills like weapons against boredom. One even drew a picture of himself falling asleep at his desk, head lolling forward. Self-deprecating humor, medieval edition. Proof that even in the most solemn settings, someone always finds a way to poke fun at their misery. Historians still argue whether these drawings were tolerated as comic relief or frowned upon as distractions from holy labor. Were they rebellious little acts, or simply a monk's version of doodling in the margins of a high school notebook? The debate continues, but either way they give us glimpses of very human fatigue hidden beneath all that discipline. You scan the room. Some monks are young faces, still smooth despite the candlelight. Others are old lines etched deep, skins sagging as though the centuries themselves press upon them. The younger ones sit more upright, strokes quick and steady. The older ones, slump movements, slower eyes darting more often toward the guttering candles. It's as if you can watch the passage of time in a single glance, youthful energy fading into worn endurance. The silence itself magnifies their labor. Every scratch of quill seems louder when paired with the groan of an aching back. You almost expect someone to sigh dramatically, to mutter about being underpaid, overworked, and invisible, but of course these men chose this life. Or maybe it chose them. Either way, their patience has become a posture as literal as the curve of their spines. One monk pauses, pressing his palms together for a moment of prayer, or maybe it's just an excuse to rest his wrists. Another rubs his temples, another blinks rapidly, forcing his vision to refocus. You realize that these are not machines cranking out text. They are frail bodies wrestling with endurance. A memory flickers. Remember when I said earlier that the bell was their alarm clock? Well, here's the cruel twist. The work itself was the caffeine. No coffee, no tea, strong enough to jolt them awake. Just parchment waiting to be filled, page after page. You imagine one monk thinking, if I keep my hand moving, I won't fall asleep, but if I stop, and then his head nearly drops onto the page. You walk slowly down an aisle, watching them like statues come to life. Some rock slightly as they write a rhythm to keep their concentration steady. Others are utterly still, only their hands moving as if they've disappeared into the text itself. And then there are the unlucky few whose posture betrays the fight against fatigue, eyes half-lidded, jaw slack, body swaying forward. You wonder how many times a monk actually fell asleep, face first, onto a page, ink blot included. The abbot reappears, moving softly among them. His presence keeps the posture rigid. You see a monk straighten instantly, as though divine lightning just jolted his spine. It's funny you can't help thinking this is the medieval version of a boss walking past cubicles. Suddenly everyone looks busy, productive, holy, even when in reality, half of them were 2 blinks away from passing out. You sit for a moment on a spare bench mimicking their posture. The wood bites into you, the angle forces your neck forward. After only a few minutes, you already feel the pinch in your back. Multiply that by 6 hours every night for decades, and you begin to understand the price of their devotion. And yet there is something strangely noble in it. Their patience is visible, almost sculptural. They are bent, yes, but not broken. In every slow, steady stroke, they insist that silence and endurance will triumph over fatigue. It's not glamorous, it's not heroic in the storybook sense, but it's persistence, and sometimes persistence is the most radical act of all. You glance again at the lines forming on a page. They are small, regular, exact, marching like tiny soldiers across the parchment. You realize that each one, however painful, is a victory. The monk's body may ache, but the text survives. Centuries later, you're here watching proof that their posture of patience carried words further than they ever imagined. The scriptorium hums on, though no one speaks. You move closer to a corner where the real magic unfolds, not just letters on a page, but colors, shapes, and gold that gleams even in dim candlelight. This is the world of illumination, where monks turned books into treasures, and where the darkness of night was pushed back by bursts of radiant light painted right onto parchment. You lean over a desk where a monk carefully applies gold leaf. He uses a fine brush dipped in a sticky substance, often glaire, made from egg whites, to prepare the surface. Then he lifts a piece of gold, so thin it almost floats away if he breathes too hard. With delicate precision he presses it onto the page. For a moment nothing happens. Then the gold catches the candlelight, and suddenly it blazes like captured sunlight. The page transforms into a miniature sunrise right there in the middle of the night. Mainstream historical fact, illuminated manuscripts weren't just about decoration. They had practical purposes too. Large initial letters marked the beginnings of chapters, guiding the reader through dense texts. And the sheer beauty of the work elevated the words, making the sacred feel visible, tangible. It was theology in pigment and gold. You can't help but smirk at the irony. These monks preached humility, yet their pages blazed with wealth that could feed a village. Was this devotion, or bling? Historians still argue. Some say the illumination glorified God alone, while others note how manuscripts also served as advertisements of a monastery's prestige. After all, when a wealthy patron visited, showing off a glittering book was the medieval equivalent of flashing a Rolex, a quirky tidbit. Not all illuminations were serious. Alongside saints and angels, you'll sometimes find playful images: rabbits jousting snails, battling knights, monks riding dragons. Imagine flipping through what you think is a holy psalter, only to find a doodled cat with a human face staring at you from the margin. These oddities weren't mistakes. They were deliberate, a kind of visual joke tucked into sacred work. Maybe they were comic relief for the monks, or sly winks for readers centuries later. You follow another monk's brush. He dips into a palette of vivid pigments: blue from lapis lazuli, red from cinnabar green, from verdigris white, from lead. Each pigment carries danger or cost. Lead paint poisoned the very monks who used it. Verdigris corroded pages over time. Lapis had to be imported across continents, worth more than gold. And yet here, it all was ground into powders and mixed with glaire or gum. Arabic transformed into luminous colors that glowed long after the candles died. The process is slow, meditative. Outline first, in ink. Then apply pigment layer by layer. Finally, add highlights of white or gleaming gold. You watch as an initial A blossoms into a miniature garden: vines, twisting flowers, blooming, a bird perched in the corner, its feathers catching the light. It's mesmerizing. You realize that illumination wasn't just embellishment, it was devotion given physical form. Each stroke was a prayer, each color a hymn. You shift your gaze to another page, this one filled with tiny illustrations. A saint stands tall, halo-gilded robe, shimmering with intricate folds. Around him, animals lurk: lions, lambs, serpents. Some look realistic, others fantastical. You wonder whether the monk ever saw these creatures in real life or whether he copied them from older books relying on imagination. Historians still argue how much of medieval art was observation and how much was creative guesswork. That's how you end up with elephants that look suspiciously like hairy pigs with trunks. The silence of the scriptorium feels different here. It's not just oppressive stillness, it's charged, vibrating with focus. You imagine the monks almost glowing with the concentration it takes to paint details smaller than a fingernail. And you standing at their side feel oddly calmed by the precision. There's something about watching a gold leaf shimmer under candlelight that makes even time slow down.
And yet fatigue still lurks. One monk sneezes suddenly. His hand jerks, leaving a crooked line of red across what was supposed to be a delicate vine. He freezes, eyes wide. You hold your breath with him. Then he sighs, sets down the brush, and begins the painstaking process of scraping and repainting. Somewhere in the room, another monk chuckles softly, the kind of laugh you try to swallow but can't. You grin. Even here, mistakes happen. Even here, someone finds them funny.
You think about how strange it is, all this labor poured into a book that most people would never see. Literacy was rare. These volumes were destined for other monasteries, cathedrals, or noble patrons. For the ordinary villager, the shimmering pages might as well have been locked treasure chests, and yet the monks painted on night after night as if the audience didn't matter. Maybe it didn't. Maybe the act itself, the brush, the color, the prayer was the point. You watch another brushstroke glide across a margin, laying down a curling vine that will never wilt, a flower that will never rot. The candle flickers, the gold gleams, and you feel the peculiar silence wrap tighter around you, not empty, not dull, but full of color, patience, and devotion. You drift further down the line of desks where the pages shift from reverent gold to something a little more mischievous. At first you think you're seeing things. Did that vine really end in a dragon's tail? Did that saint just have a comically oversized nose? You lean closer, and yes, it's there. Hidden among the sacred words are doodles, jokes, and tiny rebellions like graffiti tucked into the holiest of books. Margins in medieval manuscripts were not always empty. In fact, they often became playgrounds for imagination. One monk copying the Psalms drew a rabbit armed with a lance, skewering a knight. Another filled the edges of a sacred gospel with grotesque hybrid creatures, half human, half snail, crawling toward the text, as if to invade it. Mainstream historical fact, scholars call these strange decorations marginalia, and they can be found in some of the most solemn manuscripts in Europe. The quirky part. Some monks seem to compete at this. One doodled a cat playing the bagpipes, another drew nuns chasing runaway geese. A favorite is a little sketch of a monk so fed up with his writing task that he scrawled a cartoon of himself, quill-dangling eyes drooping. It's the medieval version of drawing a sad face in your math notebook margins. Proof that boredom transcends centuries. You chuckle quietly, but the silence of the room makes even your grin feel loud. A monk across from you is tracing a delicate lined tongue poking out in concentration. His page seems serious, intricate red and blue borders framing sacred text, but as you tilt the page, you catch it. A miniature dragon curled slyly at the bottom, looking like it's about to bite the letter Q. You imagine the monk smirking as he painted it, half daring anyone to notice. Historians still argue why these doodles exist at all. Were they acts of rebellion humor smuggled into strict devotion, or were they symbolic carrying hidden meanings now lost to us? Perhaps the rabbit spearing the knight mocked corrupt nobility. Perhaps the snails were metaphors for cowardice. Or maybe, just maybe, they were nothing more than doodles made by weary men trying to stay awake at midnight. The truth may never be clear, and that's part of the charm. As you wander, you notice how the doodles reflect personality. Some monks clearly loved animals, dogs, cats, birds, rabbits. Others leaned into the grotesque faces, contorted demons, lurking hybrid beasts crawling over the page. One particularly cheeky monk Historians note even drew rude gestures in the margin of a prayer book. You can't help but grin. Imagine a 14th century reader solemnly reciting prayers while a tiny, doodled figure in the margin is mooning them. The silence in the room deepens, but your imagination grows louder. You picture the monk who drew these things, shoulders hunched, lips, twitching quill, carefully sketching his tiny rebellion. Did he worry about being caught? Or did he know no one would care so long as the main text was flawless? Maybe the abbot even saw it and chose to ignore it, because who wants to admit the holy book is decorated with a break-dancing rabbit? One page catches your attention more than the others. The text is neat, the gold brilliant, but at the very edge, a tiny knight fights a snail. The knight's sword is raised high. The snail, unbothered, crawls slowly toward him. You can't help but laugh, it's absurd. And yet that image shows up in dozens of manuscripts across Europe. Historians still argue about it. Was the snail a symbol of the slow passage of time, or was it simply a running joke passed secretly among monasteries like a meme that went medieval viral? Whatever it was, it survived. Centuries later, you're standing here smiling at it. And there's something comforting about that. The monks weren't robots, they were human. They got bored, silly, sarcastic. They hid their humor where they could, in the quiet corners of parchment margins. And in doing so, they left echoes of themselves not just as pious scribes, but as tired men with ink-stained fingers, aching backs, and a desperate need to amuse themselves while the candles sputtered. The scriptorium feels lighter now, as if the silence itself is smiling with you. The gold leaf may blaze with solemnity, but the dragons in the margins wink. The prayers may march in perfect lines, but the rabbits leap free. And you, drifting through the midnight hush, feel both the weight of devotion and the sly grin of humanity hiding in the edges. The hush of the room settles once more, but now you notice something different. Not every page gleams with perfect lines and playful doodles. Some pages bear scars, smudges, scratches, even angry notes left by the weary hands that copied them. You lean closer to one such manuscript and see where the ink has bled, turning letters into blotches. The monk's attempt to fix it, scraping the parchment with a small knife, has left faint scars. The text continues, but the page itself carries the memory of the mistake. Mainstream historical fact: medieval scribes often corrected errors by scraping off the ink with a knife and then rewriting the line. Parchment was durable enough to take such abuse, though the ghost of the mistake often lingered. Some corrections were careful and almost invisible, others blunt and obvious like scars across the page. Quirky tidbit: sometimes monks got frustrated enough to leave notes in the margins. One famously scribbled, "Oh my hand," another wrote, "This parchment is hairy," and another, "The work is long, the day is cold, and my back is sore." You can almost hear the exasperated sigh in those words, the medieval equivalent of complaining in a group chat. You linger by another desk. The monk working there has just smeared his ink. He mutters something under his breath, too quiet to catch, but his clenched jaw says it all. He sets down the quill, picks up his knife, and begins the tedious process of scraping. The scrape, scrape, scrape echoes in the silence, louder than you expect, as though the page itself winces under the correction. Historians still argue whether scribes were encouraged to add personal comments, or whether such marginalia slipped through unnoticed. Some abbots might have frowned upon complaints, seeing them as a lack of discipline. Others perhaps allowed them, recognizing that fatigue needed some outlet. After all, even in a monastery, patience has limits. As you watch, another monk flips through finished pages, checking his work. He frowns at a crooked line, sighs, and notes in the margin, "Cursed be the one who brought the bad parchment." You almost laugh. Imagine writing that in your school essay. "This paper is terrible, blame the stationery store." His frustration feels timeless. You realize that errors weren't just irritations, they were risks. A mistake could ruin weeks of labor, waste expensive parchment, and anger a patron. Copying sacred texts carried even greater pressure. A misspelled word might seem like disrespect to God himself. The silence of the scriptorium isn't just piety, it's the tense quiet of men walking a tightrope between perfection and disaster. And yet there's humanity in those curses and complaints. The monks weren't cold machines cranking out flawless scripture. They were tired, sore, sometimes irritable. You imagine one monk shaking his cramped hand, muttering about how this was supposed to be a holy calling, not a medieval desk job. Another probably thought, if I mess this up one more time, I'll go live in the woods and raise goats instead. The errors, the corrections, the curses, they make the manuscripts feel alive. Every scrape mark, every smudge, every sigh is a fingerprint of the human struggle behind the page. You almost find yourself grateful for the mistakes. Without them, the silence of the scriptorium might feel too perfect, too inhuman. One final glance catches your eye. A line in Latin that translates to writing is excessive drudgery. It wears out the soul and the body. The letters are cramped, hurried, like someone trying to get the misery out before the abbot walked by. And yet centuries later, here you are smiling at the honesty of that complaint. It's survived. The monk's sawback is gone, his candle long extinguished, but his frustration is still echoing in your ears. The silence folds back in again, swallowing the scrape of knives and the muttered curses. But now you know it isn't perfect silence. It's layered with tension, frustration, and humanity. The hush of the midnight scriptorium carries not only devotion, but also the soundless groan of sawbacks, the invisible sighs of weary men, and the faint laughter of their hidden jokes. The pages you've seen so far hold psalms, gospels, prayers, all the safe sanctioned works that define monastic life. But not every book copied in this midnight hush fit neatly into the church's approval. Some manuscripts carried whispers of old world's pagan philosophy, banned writings, texts deemed heretical, but too precious to let die. You pause at one desk where the monk seems more cautious than the others. His quill moves with the same steady rhythm, but his eyes flick now and then toward the door. You edge closer, peering at the parchment. The words are not scripture, but something different, Greek letters, dense lines, unfamiliar names. It dawns on you he is copying Aristotle. Mainstream historical fact monasteries were central to preserving classical texts. Works by Aristotle, Cicero, Ovid, and even obscure Roman authors survived because monks copied them, often at night, far from the scrutiny of higher authorities. Without this labor, vast swaths of ancient knowledge might have vanished during the so-called Dark Ages. The quirky detail. Some monks apologized in the margins when copying pagan authors as though confessing mid-sentence. One even wrote, "I do not approve of this work, but I copy it to preserve." Imagine writing, "This book is awful, but I typed it out anyway" at the end of an essay. That's devotion, or at least stubbornness. Historians still argue whether monasteries deliberately hid heretical works or whether these texts slipped in because abbots tolerated them. Some argue monks valued knowledge for its own sake, while others think it was simple pragmatism. Patrons sometimes demanded classical works and monasteries needed the income. The line between devotion and necessity blurred in the candlelight. You picture the risk if a bishop visited and found monks copying dangerous books. Punishments could be harsh. Yet here they were, night after night, slipping pagan poetry or forbidden philosophy into the silence. There's something thrilling about it, the scriptorium, as not only a sanctuary but also a secret vault, a place where banned voices whispered across centuries. You lean closer to another page. The script is careful, elegant. A commentary on medicine, maybe Galen, maybe Hippocrates. The monk scratches steadily quill, whispering, his face composed, but his foot taps under the desk, a nervous rhythm. You can almost hear him thinking, if I get caught, I'll claim it's just Latin practice. The silence of the room feels different here. Not holy, not playful, but conspiratorial. You can almost taste the secrecy, the way the air shifts when something forbidden is present. It's like sneaking candy into a movie theater, except the stakes are centuries of lost knowledge or eternal damnation, depending on whom you ask. And the irony doesn't escape you. Without these secret midnight labors, the Renaissance centuries later might never have happened. Those bursts of classical learning, that rediscovery of Plato, Aristotle, and ancient science, all of it survived because monks risked copying works they weren't always supposed to. You think of them as reluctant smugglers passing contraband ideas into the future by way of ink and parchment. You picture one monk pausing mid-line, staring at a sentence about pagan gods or earthly pleasure. Does he shake his head in disapproval? Does he chuckle quietly thinking, well, that's not going in Sunday's sermon? Or does he secretly relish the chance to copy something less pious, something that makes his tired brain stretch in new directions? The candles flicker, and for a moment you feel the layers of time pressed together. The silence isn't just religious now, it's intellectual rebellion hidden in plain sight. Every quill stroke could be a prayer, a joke, or an act of preservation that defies authority, and you, drifting quietly in the corner, realize the scriptorium was never simply about silence. It was about survival, of faith, of humor, of knowledge itself. The night stretches on, and you begin to feel the monotony settle in an endless rhythm of scratching quills, faint sighs, and the slow drip of wax from tired candles. You glance at the monks and see it in their faces too. Copying text word for word is no short task. It's a marathon without an end, a devotion written into repetition itself. Your eyes fall on one page where the same phrase has been copied again and again. You wonder if the monk even notices anymore, or if his hand simply moves on instinct. Mainstream historical fact scribes sometimes drifted into such mechanical rhythm that they accidentally duplicated whole passages or skipped lines entirely. Scholars call this parablepsis when the eye jumps from one line to another with the same beginning or ending. Even today you can spot these slips in medieval manuscripts, silent evidence of fatigue and repetition. And the quirky detail. One monk, clearly fed up with repeating a text, scrawled at the end, "I have written this many times. It makes no sense to me." You can't help but grin. Imagine spending months copying philosophy only to throw shade at the end like a disgruntled student. The passive-aggressive energy is timeless. Historians still argue whether monks embraced the monotony as spiritual training or endured it as drudgery. Some believe repetition itself was prayer, each copied line a chant in ink. Others argue the constant boredom gnawed at monks a test of endurance more than devotion. The truth likely lies in both prayer and punishment braided together in the silence. You sit for a moment and listen. The repetition is almost hypnotic. Scratch, dip, scratch. A rhythm so steady it feels like a heartbeat. The silence isn't empty, it pulses with this steady labor, like the monastery itself is breathing through the quills. You find yourself lulled by it, eyelids heavy. You wonder if monks ever used the monotony as a kind of trance, losing themselves until hours passed, unnoticed. One monk across the room rubs his temples, another flexes his cramped fingers, a third yawns mouth wide, quickly smothering it with his sleeve. You imagine them thinking, didn't I just copy this line, or was that 3 pages ago? The danger of repetition isn't just boredom, it's losing your place entirely, a small slip that could cost hours of work. And yet despite the tedium, there's something oddly comforting in it. The endless lines, the repeated prayers, the steady hands, they weave a net of consistency in a world that was often unpredictable and harsh. Outside wars raged, plagues spread, kingdoms rose and fell. Inside, the same lines of psalms marched forward, page after page, unchanged. You realize the monotony itself was preservation. By embracing repetition, the monks ensured that nothing was lost. Still, you can't help but laugh at the thought of a monk finishing his 20th Amen for the night, rolling his eyes like someone forced to listen to the same song on repeat. You wonder if one ever whispered, "If I write this line one more time, I'll throw myself into the inkwell." But the truth is their patience was stronger. Repetition tested them, yes, but it also outlasted them. Those endless lines, those blurred memories of nights that must have felt identical, built the manuscripts that carried history forward. Their monotony became your memory. You glance again at the page before you, line after line the same rhythm. It should be dull, but instead it feels strangely eternal, as though you've stepped into a river that never stops flowing. The monks may have grown weary of the endless repetition, but here in the midnight scriptorium it's almost soothing. The silence has held so long that you almost forget it could ever break. But of course, no silence lasts forever. It begins small, a sneeze, sudden, sharp echoing against stone. The monk responsible blushes. Crimson mutters a quick apology under his breath and dabs at his nose with his sleeve. The others don't look up, but you sense the ripple of amusement. Next, a quill drops. It clatters against the wooden desk, then rolls dramatically to the floor. The sound rings louder than a church bell in the hush. The monk scrambles to retrieve it, nearly knocking over his inkpot in the process. You can almost hear his silent plea, "Please, Lord, don't let the abbot notice." Mainstream historical fact: strict rules of silence governed many monasteries, especially during Scriptoria hours. Breaking it could bring penance, fasting, extra prayers, or even public confession. Yet despite these rules, noises inevitably crept in. Sneezes, coughs, stomach growls, the clatter of a knife against parchment. Silence was an ideal, not an unbroken reality. A quirky tidbit. One surviving manuscript has a margin note where a monk wrote simply, "I am very cold." Not a holy prayer, not an error correction, just a raw complaint scribbled mid-task. You can almost hear him muttering aloud before deciding to immortalize his misery in ink. The silence may have been rule, but honesty found ways to slip through. Historians still argue whether monks strictly obeyed vows of silence in the scriptorium, or whether the occasional whispered word was tolerated. Some believe absolute silence was enforced, others suggest low murmurs like a whispered prayer, or a muttered curse were quietly accepted as long as they didn't disrupt the rhythm. Perhaps it varied by monastery, by abbot, or even by mood. You watch as another monk suddenly lets out a stifled laugh. His shoulders shake, his face buries into his sleeve. You glance at his parchment, and there it is, a ridiculous doodle in the margin, fresh ink gleaming. Maybe a rabbit jousting, maybe a crude caricature of the abbot. You grin, imagining the mischief. The silence is broken, but only for a heartbeat, and then the steady scratching resumes as though nothing happened. And sometimes the breaks are unintentional. A candle sputters too loudly, dripping wax with a hiss. A stomach growls so fiercely you'd think it was a beast in the room. A bench creaks as someone shifts their weight, the sound groaning like a door in a haunted castle. Each noise reminds you that silence is never absolute, it's fragile, layered over the small, ordinary sounds of living bodies. The abbot strolls through once more, his soft steps stirring tension. Everyone straightens. The silence hardens again as if hammered into place. You can feel the collective will in the room. Stay quiet. Stay steady. Don't sneeze. It's almost funny the effort it takes to maintain an illusion of perfect silence. You realize silence isn't the absence of noise, it's the discipline to swallow it. Still, those little breaks make the midnight chamber feel more human. If the scriptorium were truly silent, truly still, it might feel like death. But here, with the occasional cough, mutter, or laugh, it feels alive. Alive in its discipline, alive in its mistakes, alive in its refusal to remain perfectly still. You lean back and let the silence break and reform around you like waves on stone. Scratch, dip, scratch, a sneeze. Scratch, scratch, a dropped quill. Scratch. The hush breathes, flexes, stumbles, and then resumes. Imperfect but enduring, like the monks themselves. The hours have stretched so long that time itself feels different here. You glance at the flickering candles, at the endless lines of ink, and realize you can't quite tell whether minutes or centuries are passing. The silence, the repetition, the steady rhythm of quills. It bends your sense of time until it feels like you've always been here, seated among these bent figures in the midnight hush of a scriptorium. Mainstream historical fact: monks often worked through long hours of the night, especially during winter when daylight was scarce. Some monasteries divided the night into multiple offices of prayer and labor, making time feel segmented in unusual ways. The liturgical clock, not the sun, ruled their days. Imagine living without lunchtime or bedtime and instead following bells that told you when to wake, pray, copy, pray, again, and maybe eventually sleep. The quirky tidbit. Some scribes left margin notes about their strange perception of time. One wrote, "It seems like forever since I started this book." Another, more dramatic, declared, "Now I've written the whole thing for the love of God. Give me a drink." The complaints show how easily the hours blurred together as though the night stretched into infinity. Historians still argue how monks psychologically endured this altered time. Did they embrace the timelessness as spiritual transcendence rising above earthly hours, or did they suffer under it, trapped in a cycle that never seemed to end? Perhaps both are true. The same silence that felt holy to one monk may have felt like torment to another. You shift on your bench trying to imagine what it feels like to lose track of not just minutes, but years. For a monk, decades could vanish into this rhythm. One book might take months, even years to complete. Imagine finishing a manuscript only to begin the next one, immediately knowing the same candlelit nights and aching backs awaited you. The silence here isn't just about midnight, it's about centuries of repetition. The longer you watch, the more dreamlike it feels. A monk bends over his page, his face illuminated by candlelight, and suddenly you realize you could be watching him in the 9th century, the 12th, or the 15th. It makes no difference. The posture is the same, the quill the same, the silence the same. Time collapses, folding you into the continuum of this labor, and perhaps that's the strange gift of the scriptorium. Out there, kingdoms rise and fall, plagues sweep across lands, armies clash in bloody fields. But in here, time barely moves. Each letter is a stone laid in an eternal wall. Each line is a river current unchanged for generations. The monks copied words that were already centuries old, ensuring they would live for centuries more. Time wasn't their enemy, it was their medium. You blink, and for a moment you imagine the room breathing with all the centuries at once. The monks of the past are here beside the monks of tonight, their quills scratching together their sighs, layered their fatigue, shared across ages. The silence has become timeless, a hum that threads through history. It's unsettling but also strangely comforting. You realize you could close your eyes, drift to sleep, and wake 100 years later to find nothing changed. The same silence, the same scratching, the same candles flickering against stone walls. Here in the midnight scriptorium, time itself bows down to patience. The candles are burning low now, their flames trembling, as if exhausted by their own vigil. Wax pools thick on the wooden desks, hardening into strange little sculptures, stalagmites of patience marking every passing hour. You glance at the monks and see the toll. Eyes red-rimmed, shoulders sagging, movements slower, shakier. The silence hasn't broken, but it feels heavier, weighted by fatigue. One monk lifts his quill, pauses mid-air, and for a moment simply stares at the page. His hand hovers, trembling slightly before lowering again. The letters that follow are less steady, their lines wavering like a voice close to breaking. You know that feeling when exhaustion takes over and every small action feels monumental. Mainstream historical fact, scribes often worked until their candles gutted out. Oil lamps and candles were expensive, so sometimes the work literally ended with the flame. Surviving manuscripts even show evidence of smoke stains or droplets of wax where light faltered at the wrong moment. The books themselves carry the memory of tired flames. Quirky tidbit. In one manuscript, a monk scribbled, "The light is bad, the candle is dying goodbye." It's the medieval equivalent of signing off an email with laptop at 1%, pray for me. You can almost hear the weary relief in his words. Historians still argue how sustainable this schedule was. Some claim monks adapted building endurance for night work. Others suggest fatigue, often one-pages left unfinished letters, smudged as drooping heads brushed the parchment. You imagine a monk jolting awake, horrified to find he's drooled on the sacred text. Surely not the kind of illumination anyone wanted. The room feels like it's tilting towards sleep. A candle sputters violently, then dies, leaving one corner in shadow. The monk there keeps working stubbornly, tracing lines in dim light. Another monk rubs his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose, then bends back down. The silence is no longer charged with focus. It's drowsy, fragile, stretched thin. You notice how the fatigue changes the atmosphere. The earlier scratches of quills were crisp, energetic. Now they drag slower, hesitant, as though each stroke weighs more than the last. The monks look like ships listing in a harbour, sails drooping anchors, straining to keep them upright. And yet they persist. One more word, one more line. Just until the page is done, you watch a young monk blink furiously, his head nodding then snapping back up. His quill jerks, leaving a crooked stroke across the parchment. He grimaces, scrapes at it with his knife and tries again. You know that battle, the fight against your own body when even silence can't keep your eyes from closing. And then you realize this moment when candles gutter and eyelids sink is as much a part of the scriptorium as gold leaf and prayers. It's the surrender of flesh after hours of defiance. The silence takes on a lullaby quality, as though the scratching quills themselves are soothing the monks towards sleep. Finally, one last candle sputters in front of you. The flame dances wildly, then with a soft sigh disappears, leaving only a curl of smoke rising. The desk is plunged into shadow. The monk lays down his quill, exhales and presses his hands together in weary prayer. Around the room others begin to do the same, not because they're finished, but because the light itself has told them to stop. The silence deepens. No more scratching, no more muttering, no more coughs or sneezes. Just tired bodies bent over pages ready to surrender to rest. And you watching feel the hush cradle you too, as if inviting you to lay your own head down among the manuscripts. The last flame is gone now, and the scriptorium is steeped in darkness. Only the faintest trace of moonlight slips through the high windows, silvering the outlines of desks and bent figures. The monks fold their hands, some whispering prayers too soft to catch others, simply bowing their heads in silence. The night has consumed their labor, and at last the hush is absolute. You sit in the thick dark and feel how complete it is. No scratching quills, no flickering candles, no small sounds to break the spell. The silence has turned into something vast, stretching beyond the walls, beyond the monastery, into the long corridors of history. For a moment it feels as if you've been drawn into the very heart of stillness. Mainstream historical fact, after night work monks often move directly into another cycle of prayer called vigils or matins. Rest was rare, fragmented and brief. They gave their nights not only to ink, but also to psalms, their voices rising in chant long after their hands had stopped moving. Sleep was not their master, discipline was, a quirky tidbit. Some manuscripts include little farewell notes at the end like, "Thanks be to God, this book is finished," or even funnier, "Here ends the work of Brother Patrick at last." The relief leaps centuries to meet you, proof that monks like anyone felt the crushing weight of long nights and the joy of release when they finally ended. Historians still argue whether this relentless schedule broke bodies or strengthened spirits. Did the silence sanctify the hours, making them bearable, or did it slowly erode the monk's health, shortening lifespans and dimming eyes? Perhaps both are true. The silence was both a blessing and a burden, holy and harsh in equal measure. You imagine the monks leaving the scriptorium now. Slow footsteps on stone floors, sandals brushing robes, swaying. They walk into the cloisters, into the sleeping monastery, their figures absorbed by the night. Behind them, the room remains a shell of stillness, scattered with half-finished manuscripts, quills left in ink pots, wax cooling into silence. And you realize that silence hasn't ended, it's still here waiting. Every time you imagine these rooms, every time you see their books, the hush returns. It stretches across centuries, across cultures, across the world, carrying with it the weight of every monk who ever bent over a desk at midnight. The peculiar silence of the scriptorium is not empty, it's full. Full of patience, discipline, boredom, devotion, humor, fatigue. Full of the little noises that broke it and the centuries of persistence that restored it. It's not the silence of absence, it's the silence of presence, heavy with all that was endured and all that was saved. And now the silence belongs to you too. Now the candles are out, the monks asleep, and the manuscripts resting in their stillness. You sit quietly in the afterglow of their midnight labor, letting the silence linger in your own mind. It's softer now, gentler, no longer pressed with discipline or broken by coughs and sighs. Instead, it feels like a blanket drawn close, warm and steady. You breathe slowly and the hush deepens. The scriptorium fades, but the feeling remains a sense of timelessness, of patience that stretches farther than any single night. You imagine drifting backward through centuries of monks, through all their nights of work, until you're floating among countless candle flames, each one flickering in the dark, each one leaving its mark on the page. The silence is no longer peculiar, no longer strict, it's simply calm. A reminder that quiet can hold you, carry you, soothe you, that even in the longest nights, even in the hardest work, there is rest waiting at the end. So let the monks keep writing in their timeless vigil. Let the candles burn low. Let the quills scratch into the dark. You don't need to follow them any farther. You can close your eyes here in the comfort of their silence, knowing the story is still being written, but your part is finished for tonight. Sleep comes easily in this hush. The peculiar silence has done its work, not to keep you awake, but to guide you into rest. Good night.